Welcome to this month's First Friday. I am Rich Dione, co-director of the Fusion Studio for Entertainment and Engineering here at Purdue University.
And I'm Mary Pilot, and I'm the co-director of the Fusion Studio with Rich.
Fantastic. We are really pleased to welcome our guest today for what we hope will be an exciting and casual and informative opportunity to get to know one of our colleagues working professionally in the industry. That has been one of the primary missions of the Fusion Studio, is to try to build this network and community of people and to help us get to know each other. And so this is a fitting way to do that, I think. So we're really pleased to welcome Kimberly Corbett Oates, who is a principal at Schuler Shook. I'm not going to go into her whole bio. You can find it online. But we're going to talk to her about her career anyway, so we'll hear more about it. So Kim, welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to join you all today.
Awesome. So the chat will be open and available for you all. If you have questions along the way, go ahead and throw them up there. And I'll try to sneak them in as we go through some questions that I have for Kim. We sort of pre-baked a bit of an interview kind of discussion here for you all. But go ahead and throw questions up in the chat. Hopefully we'll move to some tangential, take the conversation wherever it goes. And there will be some time for question and answer at the end as well. So with that, let's just start out with the really basic stuff. You know, I know we have some students on the call today, and there may even be some of our professional colleagues who think they know what a theater consultant is, or maybe have no idea. I know for a long time I didn't really have an idea what that was. And I wonder, Kim, if you could just talk to us a little bit about what that means. What do you do? What's a theater consultant?
Yeah, absolutely. It's perhaps one of the hardest things that I need to do in my job is tell people what my job is, or at least when I first meet someone, especially casually, I say, you know, what do you do? I'm a teacher. I'm an engineer. People have an idea of what that is. Theater consultant. I usually get, so you design shows. You do the sets then. I say, well, yes, that's kind of my little side thing, is that I still work on shows and do scenic design and lighting design there. But my day job as a theater consultant is the design of performing art centers, auditoriums, even houses of worship, really kind of any venue where people gather for these communal experiences. And we are a consultant to owners, to architects, to engineers, to help them understand the specific needs of a building to accommodate those types of uses. So from the beginning of the project, we'll work through planning issues. Things like, where do the dressing rooms go relative to the stage? How big of a stage might I need to do X, Y, and Z? Sometimes our role is helping to define what it is that you want to do. There's not an ideal theater that will do everything. You need to have goals in mind for what that building is going to do, and we take those goals and translate them into physically built solutions. So we do the planning part, and then we also do equipment design. I'd say the things that I design on the equipment side are the elements that you can see and touch. And you have acousticians who specialize in the oral experience of what you can hear.
Gotcha. I mean, it's fair to say that the venues we work in are highly specialized and complicated, and you know, architects probably don't train much in how a theater works or a house of worship works. And so that's sort of the gap that you fill there, is between the client and the architect's knowledge.
Absolutely. Even architects that do a lot of theaters and do theaters at the top end, in a lot of ways, those are our best clients, because they understand that boundary of what they know and what they don't know, and where that expertise comes in. So some of our conversations get shortcut when I have a very knowledgeable architect. That we don't need to go through all the whys quite as much, but they still understand that that's not what they do day in and day out. On the other hand, if you ask me to design a wall system, or how to put windows to resist wind damage and hail. I don't know that. That's what the architect does, right? So it's really a collaboration. And for those of you that are in live production, I compare it a lot to your production team, that your director is your architect for a construction project. They have visions for the ideas of the facility and what the facility may do. But the director brings on designers to help them with the specific elements of realizing that concept. So just as you have lighting designers and scenic designers, you have your engineering team, you have your theater consultant, you have your acoustician who help to help realize that concept and that vision. And like the artistic director, you have your owner who has their particular demands for what something needs to be. And then just as you have your technical director, master electrician, those folks in construction, we have our contractors and tradespeople who then realize the ideas, the concepts, the things that we draw to make the building become physical space.
Sure. It really is a broad collaboration of a lot of people who bring different areas of expertise. That makes sense.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A design team may have, for a very complex building, may have 16 or more consultants. When you consider all the different specialty scopes, food service, as an example, has its own consultant on how to handle food service and restaurant spaces and places like that. Landscaping is its own specialty. We keep most of our focus inside the performance spaces, the planning for the audience relationships, both in the front of house, the lobby spaces, for the performer relationship and their experience in the back of house and coming to stage, and a bit for casual performance areas like out in lobbies and what have you.
Sure. I guess, sorry. It's always hard to know when someone's done talking in Zoom, right? There's this weird lag. My apologies. I mean, there's something really I imagine there must be some relief knowing that you only have to worry about your area of expertise, right? Like someone else is worried about windows that have to worry about, hail damage, et cetera. But also there must be a lot of pressure because you are the expertise about this really important part of the building.
Well, it's interesting because there's not necessarily that relief. You need to understand how some of those areas that may not be in your specialty apply to the design you're trying to achieve. So let's use windows as an example. I give parameters for windows for follow spot rooms, for control rooms, projection areas. And I'm not a glazing expert, but I've learned enough to be able to translate what our requirements are so that someone who is a glazing expert can figure out what that means for the framing, for the size of the opening that window is going to go into, and the specifications so that can be delivered on the project. And it becomes the same thing, even looking at the bones of the building. The structural engineer is the person who's responsible for sizing steel and concrete and those structures. But I'm giving them loading information for what we want to accomplish. If you think about a counterweight rigging system, all the beams that support the blocks need to be placed on a certain spacing, and they need to accommodate loads. And those parameters we're giving to the structural engineer for them to include. I'm not telling them it needs to be a W24 by 36 or a W36 or whatever that shape is. But I am telling them that I want a wide flange beam so I can connect equipment to it.
Sure.
And then as they interpret those requirements, I'm going back through their drawings and saying, okay, I see what you've done here, and we may need to adjust these relationships because the head block beam needs this relationship to the loft beams. And you learn that some of the ways that we think about things as theater practitioners and theater equipment designers are different from the way that an engineer would, that a structural engineer classically trained would. A great example of that is I'm usually looking at the bottom of steel as my control elevation, and they're thinking about top of steel. And that's a 3 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot difference. that
Sure.
we need to make sure we understand what the control dimension is and why it's the control dimension. So that's
Interesting.
part of what we help explain.
So there's this weird tension maybe, or balance between being a specialist, but also being aware enough of the other disciplines and what knowledge they need and how they work with that knowledge so that you can collaborate effectively, right?
Absolutely. You know, the best collaborations are those where you can talk about what your requirements are and why those are your requirements, and allow another designer on the team to figure out how to interpret that and put it in. And when everyone can bring creative energy from their different disciplines, that gives us the best project and the best results. You know, I work with some mechanical engineers, and in this case, mechanical engineers are heating, ventilation, and air conditioning designers for a building. They're figuring out the climate control for the facility. When I work with them, you'll find that there are some engineers that, you'll pardon me saying this, are a little bit the stereotypical, I did the calculation and this is what size this needs to be to fit in. Yeah, we've never met those folks. But then I've also worked with some, and so they need a little bit more hand-holding to say, okay, I understand you need a duct of this size. What if we change, what you really need is an area? What if we change the relative height and width of that so it can fit more compactly in this area? Can we do it? What ratio can you do and still meet the various noise criteria that you have and airflow criteria? But I work with some engineers too that work on a lot of performing arts facilities and are incredibly creative. And I think that's, you know, jumping ahead a little bit, where that liberal arts awareness and background really can help influence and inform engineering to bring fantastic solutions that are beyond what the calculations might just spit out, but thinking about how to apply those to a space and think about it maybe in an unconventional way.
Sure. And that is a great segue to the next question that I wanted to bring up. I was struck reading your bio that it starts by saying that you were a dancer. And I'm not saying that I don't believe you were a dancer. I'm sure you probably were. But what was striking about it is that to talk about yourself as a consultant and as an engineer, the first thing you say is you were a dancer. And clearly that alludes to connections between your passions for performance and storytelling. And I wonder if you could just talk about that. How do those connect for you, and how have they connected in your career?
Absolutely. So I'll back up from that a little bit by saying that certainly within my firm, and typically for theater consultants, these are folks that come from a performing arts background. And that's key to what we do, because a lot of it is translation between technical requirements that the design team needs to document what a building is going to be, and the owner's requirements for achieving art. And understanding what those art forms are, what a day in the life of a performing artist is critical to being able to design these buildings well. Right? You need to understand, if I'm doing a concert, what type of lighting am I going to do? Where do I want that lighting to come from? How bright do I want it to be? If I'm doing dance, that's an entirely different lighting than for a symphony. And it's different from if I'm doing a play. Similarly, the rigging solutions that I need and how much rigging, what type of rigging is different in those types of performances. So understanding that is really important to the role, as is understanding the audience performer relationship and whatnot. So you'll find that most theater consultants have that performing arts background and have been to a number of spaces, understand what works well, what doesn't work as well in a theater space. For me personally, I put that in the bio because that was really my first experience on stage. You know, and I'm going back to like 3 or 4 years old, having the first dance recital, and now having worked those on the other end, I said,
Sure.
I guess, we all have kind of that, that month of June dance recital kind of thoughts, right? But that was my first experience. And sure, I did the dance and whatnot. And I did it for a number of years. I don't want to dismiss that, up till college. But even then, while I was on stage and lining up and getting ready to go on, it was looking at all these ropes on the side, looking at the lights overhead. I said, man, this is cool.
Sure. Yeah.
And I continued to be involved in performance through college, transitioning really into being a musician, a flautist, and still had this thought of, I want to know how that backstage stuff works. And for a while, I couldn't do AV team because I was doing music, and you couldn't do both, right? That was kind of the school parameters. And I finally had a chance to work on productions in high school where I wasn't in the pit orchestra, so I could work on the musical and be backstage and be on run crew and have that experience. And, theater is kind of a drug. You got hooked right away on that experience.
Sure.
And really took that and grew into that as I moved into college. So I went to school as a mechanical engineer. Well, no, I went to school knowing I wanted to be an engineer. I didn't know what kind of engineer, but I knew I've always liked this idea of how do you put things together? How do you find solutions, that I love Legos and building things, and how do I build this on a larger level? My particular passions there pushed me to mechanical engineering from a mechanical design perspective, not what mechanical engineers that I work with now. I survived thermo is the way I'd put that.
There are a number of theater engineering students from Purdue who are laughing, but also feeling relief that they too can survive thermo.
You can survive thermo. Yes.
You've done a great service by making that.
Now,
Thank you.
that one gets a little bit trickier, but yes. So I did mechanical engineering, and on the side where I was working and truly working work study was in the theater. Mm-hmm. And pretty quickly started becoming a theater minor. I didn't do the major because of the specifics of the school I was in, and it would mean adding another semester, which seemed a little silly if I was going to graduate in 4 years with an engineering degree to stick around another semester to get a theater degree too. So, sure. But I did that coursework in addition to doing the engineering work. I worked on every production that our school had. I worked on all the touring shows coming in. And what I found that I really enjoyed was kind of the production manager standpoint. Looking at when a show is coming in and they send their tech writer ahead of time, how am I going to take that and realize that in my specific space? What things do I need to modify to achieve their vision in our space and make this a really smooth, easy process for them so that they say, hey, I love coming to your venue and want to keep coming back. And that was kind of the insight to a little bit of what I do now. I had no idea that there was a field called theater consulting. What I knew was I liked mechanical engineering. I liked finite element analysis. And I really liked theater. And I had a lot of people say to me, aren't those two completely different things? I mean, you're doing theater and that's all artistic, and engineering, those are different sides of the brain, and how do they come together? And I never saw that split there. To me, it all fit together. Again, looking at that rigging, thinking about how am I going to achieve a design? What kind of casters am I going to put on a set piece so that I can move it more easily? Or how can I improve this to serve the show? Those were all things that seemed like a natural connection to me. Sure. And at that time, this is well before Purdue and UNLV had theater engineering programs, people thought that was kind of odd. But I was able to find some mentors who went along with me, I'll say at least. And I ended up doing an honors thesis combining the two.
Really?
Mechanical engineering and English, which was where our theater department laid at that time.
Sure. Are you willing to share some of the details of what your honors thesis was? Did you have to tackle like a challenge or a problem of some kind?
Sure. It was Aesthetics and Regulation, Compromise in the American Theater.
Wow. You still remember the title. That's awesome.
I still remember the title. I was so, college student, so proud of myself for pulling all that together. But I was looking at some of the safety concerns that come into production, and particularly rampant 10, 20 years ago is this idea the show must go on and we'll figure out how to make it work. I'm glad to see the industry shifting away from that mindset slowly but surely. But I was really writing about that. I was writing about a particularly difficult to reach lighting position that we had in our theater, and then took that and developed a prototype for a different type of clamp for a light fixture. It's kind of like a quick grip that would make it easier to hang a light in that position. And then did, again, some finite element analysis on a cast C-clamp and where the weak points were on that and how that could be improved. And yeah, I probably went a little bit deeper in the detail than you wanted to.
No, that sounds fantastic and fascinating. I don't know if they have it on file somewhere at your school, but I may go look it up because now I want to read about it. But what's interesting about that, there's lots of things that are interesting about that story. And I want to segue to a question that we sort of talked about asking, but didn't really get into, and your work with ESTA in a minute. But Mary, I think you said that there was something up in the chat.
Yes, we have a question from, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Eben from Pittsburgh, but he wondered if you've ever been brought into a project. So we're kind of going backwards to some of your early comments, but have you ever been brought into a project to save it? And he mentioned that a theater that he used to work at was renovated without using consultants, and then they ended up having costly re-renovation associated with all of that. So do you think of an instance where maybe you've been a part of something that would reflect that?
Sure. There's kind of two angles I could take that from. One is there's ideally on a project, we're engaged very early on. And on some projects, we're even one of the first members on the team before an architect is hired. When an owner or a potential owner, someone says, I want to build a theater and I need to know what that is. And they'll bring us on and we'll do what's called programming to define the size of that space, what types of rooms may go in there, give some idea for the budget for that, and help them do what's called a feasibility study on some of those ideas. So sometimes we're in that very early, and there may not even be an architect involved at that point. A lot of projects were brought in when the architect is, so we're starting the initial design together. And that's great because all those early requirements about structure, about the heat and electrical loads that are required for the building, the planning and relationships, sight lines for the seating, those kinds of things were in early as it's coming up on paper. That's kind of the preference for how we want to work. Sometimes I get a call from someone who has a project about to go out to bid, possibly in a few weeks. So that means they're getting ready to ask contractors to tell them how much this will cost and to build it for them. And they say, we've realized that we might need some help on how this theater equipment works. And so then we're coming in pretty late, trying to figure out how to work with what's there, figure out what we can change, what we can't change. That's still before it's built, so there's still some opportunity there. For after it's built, I can't think of an example offhand of a newly built project that we've come in right afterwards. I'm sure there's some, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. But we do go back to built projects, and we do observations of installed equipment and help plan renovations to that. Sometimes that's as simple as a rigging observation, going through and saying, yeah, your equipment's in good shape, or here's the items you need to fix, and we'll help you put together a proposal that you can give to a contractor to come in and do that. Sometimes that's more cohesive, that we're coming in and saying, all right, so the sight lines from the balcony are bad. Here's some ways that we can fix that. You don't have structure in the 4-stage area, but you want to do something like what's behind me and hang some screens out there. Here are some things that we could do to do that. You want to add an orchestra pit, solving those types of problems we come in on. Sometimes those are buildings that have been around for 50 or more years. Sometimes those are newer facilities that didn't anticipate technology changes that happen pretty rapidly.
I have to imagine that comes up a lot, right? Spaces that, the last part you said there, spaces that didn't anticipate technology or changes in technology. I'm thinking about when I was in school in the 90s, firewire was the way to go for building a sound studio, right? And so everything was wrapped in firewire conduit and whatever. And then we look around and nobody's running audio over firewire. Everything is Cat 6 or better. And that's got to be, do you have to think about that as a consultant as well? Like, how do I sort of future-proof the things that we're doing? And is there an example where you bet correctly? And maybe is there an example where maybe you didn't bet as correctly and you go, oh, I wish we'd done something different?
Yeah, so in my world, where that comes up the most is really on the lighting side. We've had changes in the last 5 years in the industry going to LED. That frankly have happened far more rapidly and been adopted more rapidly than we thought they would be. If you asked me 10 years ago when we were starting to see the LED fixtures come out, we said, yeah, you may have a few. And it is in a manner of years we went from theaters that were all dimmers to theaters that have no dimmers at all.
Right, yeah.
Which doesn't necessarily mean that they're all LED fixtures. So that's kind of fun twist to plan for and to manage budgets for too. So we certainly have that. When I started consulting, we were just transitioning from doing hardwire DMX to doing lighting networks and figuring out how much copper to put in or not. In terms of future-proofing, what we do is we look at the facility, and you always have a budget challenge. I've yet to see a project where there's not a budget, and if you have a budget, you're going to have to rein in something to fit that. But within that, our priority tends to be looking at the infrastructure, making sure that we have conduit to locations, even if we're not installing the equipment at those locations on day one. If someone can only afford 15 line sets, I still want to make sure that the structure can accommodate, let's say, 30 line sets in the future, so that equipment can be added back in. Equipment is going to change. It's stuff that you can add later. We want to make sure the bones of the building can support as much of that as we can. So those things we certainly keep in mind as we're designing the infrastructure. Where we have more of a challenge and are going back to, as an industry, and are going back now, is really more in how our art form is changing. One of the biggest changes there is in immersion, and the image I'm using as my background really encapsulates that you see that there's some projection on the sidewall. We're bringing color out. Even in an end stage room, we're moving away from the production being just what is in front of you and bringing the production out around the audience. I think part of this is to help set apart what we're doing as an experience away from all the streaming on-demand technologies out there, right? What do we do about storytelling that makes people want to come out to at a specific time to see it? And this is one of the elements that we've really adopted, and I think it's great. It allows us to transport audience members and gets away from these fourth wall ideas and really surround people. That technology around the house is something that wasn't really a dominant concept 10, 15 years ago. So that wouldn't have had as much infrastructure planning for it. Now we're putting that in, but then, we didn't guess that that's where it'd be going.
Sure.
One that we got right, a very specific examples. I had a college that said they couldn't afford to do an orchestra pit lift. They needed an orchestra pit, and we would do it with platforms. And we said, let's design the concrete and the power systems and whatnot to accommodate a lift in the future, even though that adds a little bit of the cost back in. And sure enough, within 3 years, they took out the pit filler and put the lift in.
Wow.
So that was a really good call.
I bet they were incredibly grateful for having been encouraged to spend that little extra money early on.
Yeah, because trying to put some of that back in later, having to redig a deeper pit, those are really expensive to do after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating. I'm watching the clock. We're getting some more questions in the chat. We're not going to get to all the questions that I sent to you earlier. And we have at least one person who's raised their hand. So if it's all right with you, I might just sort of go to the chat, I think, and see what that brings. And I know that you've got some, one of our questions was, what are some favorite projects? And you've got some images to share. I think that's one of the questions that have come up in the chat as well. But Elena asks, can you, or what has been the most challenging project you've worked on and why? And she adds a whole lot of sort of qualifiers to that. Was it a time constraint challenge or a technical challenge or working with a team challenge? And do you have any words of wisdom to share from that experience?
Wow. So I could pick a challenging project in each of those categories.
Yeah.
This one was challenging for time. This one was challenging technically, so forth. So since I'm calling from a hotel in Lubbock today, where I'm going to go out to do a site visit this afternoon, I'm going to talk about this project. And the rendering is behind me as well. Okay. So this is Buddy Holly Hall of Performing Arts and Sciences. And it's about a $150 million project out in Lubbock, Texas.
So a small little thing.
Yeah, just a small little one. As a 2,200 seat large hall that you can see up here, a 400 seat small theater, a multi-purpose room, an attached ballet school with studios, a catering kitchen with a restaurant that'll operate out of the facility, and
Wow.
lobbying back of house spaces to support all that. So it's a large project. What added to some of the complexity was the number of users. It also adds to the excitement, frankly. So we're doing I'll say, typical Roadhouse concerns, that we're designing this to be a Broadway A-tour house that could bring in full tours. There's a local symphony that will perform here. Those are all kind of typical for this type of space. Obviously, the ballet school that's attached will perform here as well, so we accommodate the ballet. But then one of our other users is the local school district as a partner. And they want this to be one of their centralized auditoriums. They want it to be a venue where they can host statewide competitions. And all of that has very specific requirements. The other thing that happens is when you mix, let's say, a crowd that's going to a country Western artist with a school audience at the same time, there's some very practical concerns that happen. That pop artist, or country artist, is going to want to sell liquor at their event. And the school district is going to say, we want no alcohol within our parameters. So we had to look at how we could design this building to work cohesively, where all the spaces are used for the school competitions. And it feels welcoming and a great community space, but then also be able to partition it off when we have these different events happening and still keep operations smooth and not a separate building. So operationally, there were a few challenges there. For the main audience area, fun and kind of exhausting process was designing the balconies. And this gets to some of our planning and really working closely with engineers and architects. We wanted to keep a pretty intimate experience for all of our audience. So it's not a very long building. Instead, we pushed people up. And when you go to a higher balcony, it brings those people from the back closer to the stage. So that's good. But as we do that, and as we get closer, those sight lines get steeper and tricky. This is also a horseshoe-shaped room, which adds to some of those side sight lines. So when you go to the balconies in this venue, in each balcony, there is one row that is flat, as you might expect, and curved in plan. And the rows below it smile down through the slab, and the rows above it smile up through the slab. And to figure out how much we were changing those rows through each environment, or through each seat, we actually did chair by chair studies. Looking at the sight line, we relied pretty heavily on Revit for this to figure out if the chair in front of me is at this height, then where do I want the seat behind it to be?
Sure, yeah.
And really define almost as a coordinate system what was happening on all of those balcony rows and look at it three-dimensionally. So that was complex in the design element. But then we went into thinking about engineering. And there's a bit of a handoff between how far I go thinking about engineering on a project for the specific product design and what the contractor does. I'm not designing the size of the bolts. I'm not calling out steel shapes necessarily. I'm giving parameters for how something needs to work. I'm thinking about the space that fits in, but the specific machinery design, or in this case, a chair design, is going to someone else.
Sure.
When you have a floor that slopes like this, and you have chairs on it, you don't want the chairs to be parallel to the floor, because then everyone is sitting like so. So each chair had to be adjusted so that the seat pan would be flat, and so that the backs all fit and look aligned, and it's not obvious to someone looking at it that the chair is all slanted. And then we had to define, all right, once we do that, the armrest on the left and the armrest on the right aren't at the same height. And what is our tolerance for that? So we had to do a number of studies. We did mock-ups, sitting in chairs and feeling what was comfortable. And then we have to take that, put that into parameters that we can hold someone to in a contract, so that the chair designer, chair manufacturer, can then meet all of those ideas that we put in there and execute it. So that was a pretty complex, challenging element just to get chairs in on a project.
Love it. I love it. So there's an essayist, Annie Dillard. If any of you have read her, you'll know why she's amazing. She grew up in Pittsburgh, and she has a memoir called An American Childhood. And she talks about, as a kid, her neighbor was an architect and gave her a drawing book, right? A learn to draw book. And she writes a lot about discovering and being amazed by the fact that drawing exercises, there's a 5-minute sketch of a still life and a 15-minute sketch of the same still life and a 30-minute sketch of the same still life. And they cause you to focus on different levels of detail, right? And I'm just sort of reminded of that, because I don't know that it would occur to me that the level of detail of the arm height is a bit of chairs on a ramped or an inclined floor. It's clearly something that needs to be thought about. And as you sort of think about a a large project like a building, there is the macro view of the whole thing, and then you have to also think about that sort of real detail level stuff, and that you can spend hours and days and weeks and months, I'm sure. That's fascinating. There was a hand up earlier. Eric, I'm going to say your name wrong, I think here, Breakjern. I'm going to go ahead and unmute your mic so you can go ahead and ask a question if you're still ready. Or at least I'll let you mute your mic is what I'm allowed to do here in Zoom.
You have to unmute.
There you go.
Yeah, I'm terribly sorry. I must have just bumped my button as it was.
So you did not have a question.
My apologies. I did not have a question.
Okay, well, you can have one now if you have one. But
well, certainly. I guess I am the stage supervisor at the Alley Theater in Houston. We employed our own theater consultants for our recent renovation. Not nearly the scale that Lubbock went through currently. But I will say, just for the group, is that the consultants that we employed with our GCs, general contractors, were invaluable to us when we were going through that process. And so I can't stress enough the work that happens and that you do when you're going through this process is invaluable. Get those theater consultants as early as you can in the process, because they are a lifesaver.
absolutely. Thanks, Eric.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Sure.
Yeah, Eric, what I'll add to that is there's a bit of a different mindset between what someone is thinking about as a technical director or rigging supervisor, even lighting supervisor, than what you think about as you're designing the system infrastructure for it. So the relationships that we have with operators are invaluable to making sure that we understand how specific users will use a building. Because of course there's differences, there's preferences and whatnot. And when we have very knowledgeable users like that, it's great to have those conversations, and the consultant role becomes kind of the translator between this is what they're saying they need for theater, and here's what it means to you, Mr. Electrical or Mrs. Electrical Engineer, to be able to provide power at these locations that they want and to meet these requirements. So there's a bit of a difference there between what we do and understand as practitioners in the theater versus what needs to happen for construction drawings for a contractor to build it. So that's part of what we do.
So we're at about quarter of, and I know, again, I'm going to mention it again, I know you brought some photographs of things to share, and I think that we'd all would love to hear you talk about some of your favorite projects or interesting things you've worked on. So do you want to share some images with us and talk through some things?
Sure. I'm going to talk a little bit more kind of about what a theater consultant does, and if there's an image here that really strikes someone that you say, hey, I want to know a little bit more about that, we can stop, go back, anything like that. So I mentioned earlier that we have a design team that puts the whole project together, and this is just a list of different players that might be on a project. The other thing I wanted to share with this image is a little bit of kind of a day in the life, particularly pre-COVID. Just putting drawings up, looking at things together, looking for solutions that meet the various interests architecturally from an engineering standpoint and whatnot. Let's see how to advance this. Okay. So some of what we do is get very far into the details. Here's a range of different catwalk elements that we've done there. These are, many of my pictures tend to be work in progress from site visits, particularly in details. So yes, the pin rail here does not have any pins in it, and it did eventually, just not on that particular day. but looking at different catwalk requirements, understanding different users as to whether we want a catwalk. This is one that's kind of fenced in, so it has a higher degree of protection, if you will. Might be really good for a high school user versus one that has a lot of adjustability in the pipe height for a more professional user. I think most of you in theater have seen this. These are the equipment elements that I am designing after we've given the structural loads to our engineers. More just kind of getting into the details of what we do. So there's rigging sections, there's gridiron planning, coordinating how the conduit runs across the gridiron, not be in the way of something else. We look at lighting systems and infrastructure. Of course, this is an old picture with old equipment that I didn't update. And I think I clicked through too quickly. Yeah, let's start in the middle. So here's the shiny. I look at lobby spaces, and we look at how these can really serve the public. This one on the left is one of my favorite projects at Moody Performance Hall. This is one where my firm also did the architectural lighting design, which is a little bit of a different animal from the theater planning in here. But you know, this is a building that's really there for community users. We interviewed about 65 different arts groups around Dallas that weren't performing, or sometimes performed, but mostly were small to mid-size groups and weren't performing in the big venues in town. They were spread out in little kind of basement type theaters around town. And we wanted to create a home for them in the arts district as a place to kind of grow their audiences, show that they're really, you know, moving up and showcase them. So this building is operated by the city. We had to think about what that means in material choice, that it would be easy to maintain, inexpensive to maintain, and last for a while, but also how it could be welcoming to the community. And this lobby is one area where we were really able to capture that. There's kind of these large tiered stairs in the middle that could be used as seating area for performance down below, or can allow audience on the lower slab while performers are up on it. So even lobby spaces, as I mentioned before, play into how performances can happen. We think about the outside of projects. This is down in the Rio Grande Valley. It's University of Texas, RGV. And really a fun project here. This is inside is a concert hall. Something that I enjoy about this project and what we do is when I'm working down in the valley. So Rio Grande Valley is as far south as you could go in the continental US and still be in the United States, right? It's the border towns with Mexico. And when we work down there, the culture is very different than some other places, than mid-America, for example. And we're able to embrace that and use that to inform the design, so that this venue is designed to accommodate more flamenco and folkloric ballet and things like that. And it's really fun to have a building that has a sense of place and ties into the people and the local culture and working with them. This is also down the valley. This is the McGowan Performing Arts Center. Here, some of our challenge was looking at catwalk positions with these really complex arcs that are happening overhead, you know, a little bit towards Radio City in a dressed up way. I mentioned doing sightline studies. So just for those of you that kind of geek out on drawings and things like that, I thought I'd share some of how we look at that and adjust balconies depending on criteria for a specific space. Look at back of house areas. Here are just some images of how different spaces can be. thinking about what happens out in the audience area, how we accommodate lighting and things like that. So those are a few examples of the work we do. I had Rich. I don't know if there's any questions or specific items that people would like to dive into.
Well, those are beautiful. So many cool things. There was a big winch at some point in some rigging that you floated through that I certainly was excited about, but I want to leave open. We've got about 10 minutes left before we're done for the day here. So this is a good opportunity to open it up to the room. If you have questions about any of the images you've seen that Kim has shared that you want to ask some follow-up questions on, or if there are questions in general that you have, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand or throw it up in the chat. If you don't have any questions, that's fine. I certainly have more that I can bring up. So we'll give you a couple of minutes to type some things or raise your hands. Do you happen to remember, Kim, what that giant winch was from?
Well, there's a number of giant winches, so I'm not sure.
There probably are. That's all right.
Which one that is. I was actually going to pull up another one while you were talking.
I'll see if I can soft shoe for another couple of seconds here while you find the photo. We were talking earlier before y'all got here about the travails of going from 2 monitors when you're doing these kinds of things to 1 monitor, and now you got to flip through all these screens to find stuff. While Kim is looking, Chesney has asked, how much of the support area do you work on? She says, I know you've worked on the main theater space, but do you also work on the scene shop, storage areas, et cetera, if those are needed by the venue? Is that part of your purview?
It can be. The degree, how far we go varies from project to project and the needs. So for a scene shop, on some projects, we're saying, you need this much space. For some projects, we're doing equipment layouts and working closely, hopefully, with the technical director, because scene shops are very personal spaces.
They are, yes.
So working with them, certainly looking at flow issues from the idea of materials coming in, being assembled, being painted, going to stage. We talk about those kinds of things with the architects and help them plan that as well. So we do some planning. The extent depends on the project.
Gotcha.
Similar for costume shops too. Again, I think you could get all the costume designers, costume shop managers, in the same room, and no two will agree on what that shop layout should be. But we try to provide space and flexibility so that the users can make that work for them.
Sure. I think it's true. If you were to get 10 TDs together, you'd have 10 different designs for a scene shop, and 10 costume shop managers together, you'd have 10 different designs for a costume shop. Absolutely.
At least 10. At least 10.
Right. I might have 2 in my head that I would like for a scene shop. We got 2 really interesting questions that came in the chat, both of which are probably a half hour long each, but we'll try here to squeeze them both in. The first is from Barry. How do you approach architects that have not worked with theater consultants before and may not have any theater experiences? What does that collaboration start to look like?
Sure. I'll say, let's say that I've already convinced the architect, or someone has convinced the architect that they want to work with a theater consultant. So we've made that, and now we're getting into working together. A lot of our role becomes education. And I'm not trying to tell that architect how to operate a theater. And frankly, that's not what they want to know, but we are explaining to them what they need to do. And in some ways, there's not a lot of difference between the architect doing their first theater and the architect who's done 40 theaters in terms of the type of information that I'm going to give them. In both cases, I'm going to do an elevation of the stage, say, here's my grid, here's my galleries, and keep this zone clear, don't put anything there. How much I need to clarify what keep this clear means often depends on the level of the architect. Those that have done theaters before understand that clear really means that. The other thing that I like to do with any design team members that are doing one of their first theaters or the first of this type of theater is take them on a tour of a facility and walk through it, take them up into the catwalks, not just the pretty architectural tour, but really get up into technical spaces, even go into mechanical rooms and show them the size of that equipment, point out where coordination went really well, point out things that could have been done better. And help them understand that, because a drawing gives you technical information, but you don't really understand it. You're saying, I'm taking these notes and I'm putting it on my paper. Photographs help explain it a little bit more, but walking the building is when people really understand that.
Sure.
So when you have someone who is open to listening, which you hope is a characteristic of your architect, it's just that education and talking and working together. And I've done very successful venues with people who haven't done the theater before. I'm
reminded, I'm a teacher, so I'm always going to be a teacher. And I'm really thinking about my students who are on the call. I'm reminded of it's very much the same dance that you have to have as a TD with a set designer, right? Just determining what level of willingness to listen they're able to have when you have to talk about things that are possible versus not possible, right? And how you have to carefully earn that trust and in that conversation, right? So that you are helping the people you're collaborating with come to a place where they want to listen as much as possible. It sounds like it's very similar.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we've got time for this last question to at least acknowledge that it's an interesting question, but and maybe get into it a little bit. But Gary asks specifically about the spaces that are on the screen. What is the thought process when designing semicircular shapes on stages or for stages? And he says, as a designer, he finds them particularly difficult to design for as a set designer. And I can certainly understand how they dictate some things for you visually. So could you talk about that a little bit, or is that part of what you have an understanding of?
Sure. I think that question, if I'm understanding it correctly, really gets to theater forms. And this is a item that we really need to discuss with the owner or operator and the architect very early on. This goes into the question of what type of space are we trying to build and why? So the proscenium space, like you see in these venues, this is we have the stage house, we have an apron, we have the audience on one side, and you're looking at presentation. This is the easiest type of space for particularly young performers to perform in, younger directors to direct in, and for designers to accommodate, because you have a back and a front. And you're talking in the same direction. It makes it pretty easy. And it works well for a lot of art forms. But there are some that want something different. So when we get into thrust stages, these types of venues work differently. And understanding that this type of space is used and operated differently is really important. I think this is a little bit of what you're getting at, Gary. When you have this thrust space, particularly this one at the theater school at DePaul on the left, with this very prominent thrust, this is not a space where you can do tall scenery. You're talking about more chandeliers and elements like that dropped from above, and more set dressing type pieces. With maybe some backdrop behind. But the advantage to this kind of space is that it brings the performers closer to the audience and vice versa. So there's more of a sense of intimacy in these areas. You're also letting the audience see more of each other. And that can be a desirable characteristic as part of that shared experience, that you look across, you see that person's laughing, and you're laughing too, and it's a moment that you've had together. So these are high in intimacy, but much harder to direct in. It's harder for actors to perform in because they need to address people around them on 3 sides. And of course, when we go in and around, it's even more than that. But when you're looking at a cabaret experience, like the example, the setup, in this case on the right, it is great. You're up closer to the performer. You could be right there seeing the musician, plucking their strings on the guitar. It's great.
I think
another form would be the flexible space, which could be reconfigured depending on what you need. And again, that would change the staging, the scene design, the lighting design. All those elements need to change depending on the production, and the infrastructure of the space, going back to that idea, needs to accommodate that, understanding that there's going to be different configurations.
I appreciate that answer, Kim. And Gary has just added a little bit of clarification. I wondered if I didn't actually communicate his question clearly. Some of the proscenium photos you had show a curved apron versus a rectangular or a rectilinear apron. And I think that may have been what he was really trying to get at. Is that an architectural choice? Is that a client's kind of choice? Is that something dictated by something that comes out of the consultant process that, maybe orchestra lifts are easier with a curved front? I don't know.
Yes. So Gary, I apologize for going to theater 101 on you there. The stage front is one of the elements that evolves as we look at the seating bowl and the stage itself. So how tight of a wraparound we want for the audience helps inform that. When we curve the audience, we're able to get more people closer to the stage than when we do straight rows. So again, even a slight radius, where we're not talking about these big thrusts, can increase the intimacy. And the tighter that gets, you're right, the more that it creates those side viewing angles that you need to think about for masking and so forth. So you'll see both of these examples have a rounded front, but not a very tightly rounded front. Generally, we want the stage form to follow a bit of that seating so that we're not creating a big gap between the two and to create some connection. But that's part of the evolution of the design of the space. I certainly have examples that are flat rather than rounded.
So if I'm hearing you right, it's a little bit about this balance of capacity, seating angle, and closeness to the stage that all sort of become part of the design process.
Yeah, and even getting more technical, it comes down to some of the programming. If I have a room with orchestral music in it, those sidewalls are very important for reflections of the sound into the audience. And that informs where the sidewalls are. So then we're responding to that with the shapes as well. So all of those things kind of play together.
Which is kind of a nice note to wrap this up on. It takes us all the way back to some of what you talked about earlier in terms of balancing being deeply specialized in your area, but also aware enough of everything else, right? The curvature of that stage apron is so intertwined with so many elements that are not necessarily about the physicality of the scenery on stage. And everybody on the team has to somehow be aware of that. That's really, I find that really interesting and exciting. We are a little after 1. We've run you all a little bit long. Mary, I don't know if you have any closing thoughts you want to share before we sign everybody off here.
No, I just want to thank Kim for participating today and sharing this wealth of knowledge. It was absolutely fascinating. You provided a wonderful segue for our next First Friday, where we'll have acoustician David Schwinn come in and talk about how he manages through some of the same sorts of things that you experience working with the other consultants and specialty areas. So thank you for all of this and the wonderful transition.
Absolutely.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Kim. It was a real pleasure. And thank you, everybody. You'll see some notices about our next First Friday pretty soon. So we look forward to seeing you register for that. Have a fantastic day. Stay safe and healthy, everybody.